Deep in the Ozark Highlands, where the ridgelines fold into one another like pages of an old book no one was ever meant to read, there is a mountain that locals refuse to name out loud after dark. They call it Blood Mountain. Not on any official map. Not in any county record. Just Blood Mountain, passed down through whispered warnings and the kind of silence that fills a room when a stranger asks too many questions. And for over a century, that mountain belonged to the Hollis Clan. What you are about to hear is not folklore. It is not legend. It is a documented history of one of the most isolated, violent, and deliberately hidden family dynasties in American mountain culture. A family that controlled land, bloodlines, and the movement of people through those hills for generations. A family whose roots, if you follow them deep enough, do not stop at the Ozarks. They stretch back further than most researchers are willing to go. Because the Hollis Clan is not just a story about poverty and violence and inbreeding and mountain law. It is a story about what happens when a family inherits something older than the country they live in. Something that predates the Republic, something that predates the settlement. Something that, if the evidence is examined carefully and honestly, may predate the entire official history of the American continent as we have been taught to understand it. This is the story of the Hollis Clan of Blood Mountain. And once you know it, you cannot unknow it. The Ozark Plateau sits in the interior of the continent, a high, ancient, eroded landscape that geologists say has been above sea level longer than almost any landmass in North America. The rocks there are old in a way that defies easy comprehension, 600 million years in some formations, the kind of deep time that makes the entire span of recorded human history feel like an afternoon. And embedded in those rocks, if you know where to look, are things that do not belong to any version of history that has been handed to you in a classroom. Stone foundations that predate any recorded settler construction by margins that no available explanation accounts for. Tunnels that do not appear on any mining survey, in any county record, in any geological filing. Chambers cut into limestone with a precision that 18th and 19th century frontier tools could not have achieved under any realistic set of circumstances. And in certain places, particular geometric arrangements of massive stone blocks, half-buried, moss-covered, swallowed by the forest over what must have been an enormous span of time, that bear an uncomfortable and largely unacknowledged resemblance to construction methods documented on the other side of the world. The kind of construction that built things meant to last. In Tartarian research, in the broader investigation into the hidden architectural history of this planet, the Ozarks have been curiously under-examined. The conversation tends to focus on the cities, on the world's fairs, on the grand civic buildings that appeared seemingly overnight in the mid-19th century, assembled by a workforce and with a technical capacity that the standard historical record struggles to account for. But the mountains hold their own secrets, and those secrets are older, rougher, and far less convenient to explain. The highlands are remote, the records are thin, and the people who knew the most about what was there have, generation by generation, gone quiet. The Hollis family, by the best available genealogical reconstruction, first appear in Ozark records in the 1840s. A man named Corvin Hollis filed a land claim in what is now the remote northwestern corner of a county that, notably, did not complete its own survey records until well into the 1870s. The gap matters. Because in that gap, Corvin Hollis was establishing something on Blood Mountain that the county had no interest in documenting. But Corvin Hollis did not arrive from nowhere. And this is where the official story begins to develop its first significant crack. Church records from a small settlement 40 miles to the east contain a reference, dated 1831, to a family of that name arriving from the Old Territories. No further specification. Old Territories. It is the kind of phrase that meant something precise to the people writing it down, and has meant almost nothing to the historians who encountered it later. Old Territories. Pre-statehood land. Pre-organization land. Land that existed, in the understanding of early 19th century Americans, before the United States formally claimed it. But here is the thing about Old Territories in the context of Ozark history. There are oral traditions, maintained by certain families and certain old line communities in that region, that describe a prior civilization in those hills. Not indigenous in the sense of the recognized tribal nations, though those histories are complex and contested enough on their own, something different, something older. Structures and pathways and marked stones that were already ancient when the first European descended settlers arrived. Already ancient, already partially ruined, already covered in the particular patina of abandonment that takes centuries to accumulate. The Hollis family, according to the oldest available testimony collected by a regional historian named Amos Kirtwell in 1921, knew where those structures were. More than that, they lived among them. They built on top of them. They incorporated the old stonework into their own construction, the way people in medieval Europe incorporated Roman ruins into their homes. Not out of ignorance, out of something much more deliberate. Kirtwell, who interviewed 8 surviving residents of the Blood Mountain area before most of them refused to speak further, recorded the following. He was told that the Hollis homestead, the original structure built by Corvin and expanded by his sons, sat on a foundation that no member of the family had laid. The foundation was already there. The stones were massive, fitted without mortar, and on the inner face of the largest cornerstone, turned inward so it would not be visible from outside, there was a symbol. No one Kirtwell spoke to could describe it precisely. They all said the same thing. It looked like it had been there as long as the stone itself. Corvin Hollis had 4 sons who survived childhood. Denton, Marsh, Cale, and a 4th referred to in most records only as the younger, a designation that in Ozark mountain culture sometimes indicated illegitimacy and sometimes indicated something else entirely. A child set apart, marked, given a role within the family structure that the others did not share. The younger, by the account of those who remembered him in old age, was the one who knew the mountain. Who could move through it in darkness without a lantern? Who knew which passages went where, and which chambers, underground, had been there before any living person's grandfather was born? By the 1880s, the Hollis family controlled roughly 12,000 acres of Blood Mountain and the surrounding ridgelines. This is a remarkable amount of land for a family that had no recorded commercial enterprise, no timber contract, no mineral claim, and no documented income of any kind. Counties in that era were not particularly diligent about investigating the financial affairs of isolated mountain families, but the land was there, deeded, recorded, defended with a ferocity that multiple surviving accounts describe in terms that go beyond ordinary frontier property disputes. People who tried to cross Hollis land without permission did not always come back out. This is not speculation. Between 1,878 and 1,903, county coroner records document 11 deaths in the Blood Mountain area, with causes listed as accident, exposure, or unknown. Of those 11, 7 were individuals who had either expressed interest in the mountain's interior or had been observed attempting to access the upper elevations. One was a surveyor hired by a railroad company that was quietly investigating a possible route through the highlands. He was found at the base of a cliff, with injuries his colleagues described as inconsistent with a fall. The railroad company withdrew its survey team. The route was never developed. And Blood Mountain remained, functionally, a closed territory under the authority of no government and every Hollis. What were they protecting? This is the question that serious researchers have circled for decades without being permitted close enough to answer it directly. But the fragments that exist, the partial accounts and the photographic evidence and the surveying anomalies and the geological reports that raise questions their authors never fully pursued, these fragments point in a consistent direction. There are structures on Blood Mountain that should not exist. In 1947, a veteran of the Second World War named Gerald Pitts returned to the Ozarks, where he had grown up, with a government surplus aerial photography kit. He spent 3 summers photographing the highland terrain from a small aircraft. His photographs, which circulated briefly in regional academic circles before disappearing from the available record, reportedly showed, on the upper elevations of Blood Mountain, a series of geometric earthworks, not natural formations. Not the kind of irregular shapes that erosion and vegetation produce. Precise rectangles, a long straight feature that Pitts described in his notes as resembling a causeway. And at the highest accessible point, a depression in the earth, roughly circular, that he believed represented the collapsed roof of a substantial underground chamber. Pitts attempted a ground survey of these features in 1951. He was met at the Hollis boundary by 3 men he could not identify and told to leave. He left. He never returned. His photographs have not been located in any archive that will acknowledge holding them. But he was not the only one. A geologist named Francis Alderman, working for a state university, submitted a grant proposal in 1968 for a survey of Ozark limestone formations in the Blood Mountain region. The proposal cited, as justification for the survey's significance, reports of unusually regular cave systems in the area, systems that previous explorers had described as bearing evidence of modification. Artificial enlargement of passages, smoothed walls. In one account, what appeared to be a cut stone threshold set into the rock at the entrance to a deeper chamber. The grant was denied. The cited accounts were described in the rejection letter as lacking credible sourcing. Alderman retired the following year. She gave one interview, near the end of her life, in which she said that she had been told, unofficially, by someone she declined to name, that the Blood Mountain area was considered, in certain circles, to be a matter of ongoing sensitivity. That was the word used. Sensitivity. Ongoing sensitivity in 1968, for a mountain in the Ozarks, for a limestone cave system. You have to ask yourself what, exactly, was being kept sensitive. The Tartarian hypothesis holds that the official timeline of American and global civilization has been significantly compressed or falsified. That there existed, prior to the civilization we have been taught to recognize as modern, a far more technically and architecturally sophisticated global culture, the remnants of which survive in suppressed records. In the built environment of the 19th century World's Fairs, in anomalous construction discovered beneath cities and in remote territories, and in the maintained silence of institutions that have had access to the relevant evidence and chosen not to present it publicly. Blood Mountain, examined through this lens, is not an anomaly. It is a node. One point in a network of sites across North America where the physical evidence of that prior civilization survived into the modern era was encountered by the people who settled the continent, and was, for various reasons, either built upon, guarded, or quietly suppressed. The Hollis family on this reading were not simply violent and isolated mountain people. They were, whether by inheritance or by circumstance or by something darker and more deliberate, the custodians of one of those nodes, the inheritors of a site that someone, at some point, had decided needed to remain closed. Whether that decision originated with Corvin Hollis himself, or with whatever he found when he arrived at Blood Mountain, or with parties further removed who had reasons of their own for keeping the mountain sealed, is something the available evidence cannot answer cleanly. What it can answer is, what happened to the people who lived there, and what happened to the land itself when that custody eventually fractured. The Hollis clan began to decline in the second decade of the 20th century. Not through any dramatic single event, but through the kind of slow dissolution that isolates under sustained pressure. The male line thinned. Of Corvin's grandsons, only 2 produced sons of their own. One of those sons died in France in 1918. The other, a man named Ruel Hollis, became the de facto patriarch of Blood Mountain at the age of 19, inheriting a domain his great-grandfather had carved from the wilderness and a responsibility he had not been fully prepared to carry. Ruel Hollis is the Hollis family member about whom the most documentation exists, which is still not very much. He appears in county tax records, in 2 court proceedings related to property disputes, and in the written recollections of a schoolteacher named Dolores Finch, who operated a one-room school 6 miles from the Hollis boundary in the 1920s and 1930s. Finch, whose memoirs were self-published in a small edition in 1964, described Ruel as a man who seemed to carry the mountain with him wherever he went. Her words. He seemed to carry the mountain with him. She also noted that he spoke, on the few occasions she encountered him, in the small nearby settlement where he occasionally traded, of the old things as if they were people. As if the structures and the passages and the chambers were entities with which he had an ongoing relationship. Fench was writing in 1964, long before Tartarian research had developed as a framework. She had no vocabulary for what she was observing. But what she observed was a man whose interior landscape had been shaped by something that did not correspond to the world outside the mountain. Ruel died in 1941. The circumstances of his death were never formally investigated. He was found by a neighbour, a rare intrusion onto Hollis land that itself suggests the usual border enforcement had broken down, whether through Ruel's declining capacity to maintain it, or through something more abrupt that had removed his ability to enforce it at all, at the base of a large stone formation near the upper boundary of the property. The stone, described in the brief newspaper account of the discovery, was not a natural outcropping. It had been dressed, cut, not recently. The weathering on the cut faces was described, by the county official who briefly examined it, as consistent with very great age. He did not specify what he meant by very great. He did not pursue the question further in any available record. The stone bore, on its upper face, markings that the newspaper reporter described as Indian carvings, the default attribution of the era for anything anomalous that resisted a more comfortable explanation. What the reporter did not record, but what the neighbour who found Ruel's body told at least 2 people in the years following, was that Ruel appeared to have died facing the stone, not fallen against it, facing it, deliberately positioned or having positioned himself before whatever happened to him happened. The neighbour did not know what to make of this. Neither did the 2 people she told. Neither, frankly, does the researcher who eventually tracked down this account, decades later, in a handwritten letter preserved in the collection of a local historical society that has since closed, and whose holdings were distributed without a complete inventory. The remaining Hollis family, 2 women and a teenage boy who was Ruel's son, left Blood Mountain within 6 months of his death. Where they went, no one in the area could say. The land reverted to county ownership for unpaid taxes in 1944. It has changed hands several times since. Each owner, in the available record, has made some initial effort to develop or survey the property, and each has subsequently withdrawn without explanation or sold at a loss. The current owner of the majority of the Blood Mountain parcel is a limited liability company registered in a state on the opposite side of the continent. The registered agent is a law firm representing several dozen similar LLCs with no public-facing business activity. The land sits undeveloped. The Hollis structures, or what remains of them, sit on that land. Whatever is beneath the surface of Blood Mountain, whatever Corvin and the younger and Ruel spent a century guarding, remains unexamined by any institution that would publish its findings. There is a researcher, one who has asked to remain unnamed, who spent 4 years piecing together the Hollis story from the fragments available, county records, the Kirtwell interviews, the Fench memoirs, aerial survey data, geological filings, reports from hikers and hunters who have wandered onto the Blood Mountain property in recent decades and returned with descriptions of stone features that do not match any known settler construction. This researcher's conclusion, offered cautiously and with appropriate acknowledgement of the gaps in the evidence, is as follows. Blood Mountain is a site of genuine architectural and historical significance that predates European settlement of the Ozarks by a potentially very long period. The Hollis family, upon arriving in the 1840s, encountered this significance directly. Their subsequent behaviour, the land control, the violence, the closure of the mountain, the way they spoke about the site when they spoke about it at all, is consistent with a family that had assumed custodial responsibility for something they understood, on some level, to be extraordinary. Whether that responsibility was self-appointed, inherited from a prior understanding, or in some way compelled by the site itself, is a question the available evidence cannot answer. What can be said is this. The Hollis Clan of Blood Mountain are not simply a grim footnote in Ozark history. They are, potentially, a piece of a much larger story, a story about what was here before, what we think was here, A story about the people who encountered those remnants and made choices, some of them violent and some of them quiet, and some of them simply the choices of people trying to hold together something they did not fully understand, about what to do with them. That story is still being written. Blood Mountain is still there. The foundation stones are still there. The chambers, if the accounts are to be believed, are still there beneath the surface of the earth, still fitted, still sealed, still waiting for someone with the access and the willingness to look. The Hollis Clan kept that from happening for 100 years. Whatever keeps it from happening now is a different kind of institution with different kinds of tools. But the result is the same. The mountain stays closed. The old things stay in the dark. And the official history of the American continent continues to be told without this chapter in it, not because the chapter does not exist, but because someone in each generation has decided that you are not supposed to read it.